Welcome back. The Defense Department reports recent reform efforts have saved the Pentagon $37 billion. But that number may not be the right number. Elizabeth Field is Director for Defense Capabilities and Management Issues at GAO. Elizabeth, welcome. Thanks for coming on the program. I cite that $37 billion number from the work that you have done on this. And you write that you found those reported savings from its reform effort to better align resources are largely reflected in its budget materials. There's a but there, though, isn't there, Elizabeth?
There is, but I should stop and say that seeing those cost savings reflected in the budget justification materials is a huge step forward for the department. That's something that we haven't seen in past years. And so being able to validate that those figures were in fact reflected in the budget was important to acknowledge. So let me start there. There is a but, though, as you said, a couple of ones. First, when we looked at the underlying analysis for those cost savings figures, there just wasn't a lot there. And it's important when you're developing cost estimates to take into account things like whether inflation should be considered, whether there are opportunity costs like the startup costs for implementing a reform initiative. So that's an issue. Another issue is that we found many of the initiatives that we selected to review as part of this $37 billion in savings were not really the result of reform efforts. So when we think of reform, we're talking about changing fundamentally the way that the department does business so that in the long term, the department is operating more efficiently. But we found that some of the savings were related to things like delays in contracts. So for example, delays in the Navy's ship-to-shore connector, which is a type of landing craft, or delay of construction of health facilities. Well, if we're going to construct those facilities or get those landing crafts in a few years, we're still going to realize those costs.
Is that why that matters, Elizabeth? Because classifying it in that way doesn't really count?
Well, I mean, it counts in the sense that for the time being, these resources can be put to other needs. The whole idea here is to shift resources from some more of the back office functions of the department to really supporting the warfighter. And so that did happen. But to suggest that this was the result of reform entirely is not quite right. And as you know, GAO has long been pushing for the department to improve its approach to business transformation. It's one of our high-risk areas. And so we would really like to see the department have more refinement around how it talks about reform and the savings that it realizes from reform.
All right. About the first but that you cited a moment ago, Elizabeth, you write it this way: GAO was unable to determine the quality of the analysis that led to DOD's savings decisions. What did you not have that you would have liked to have had to be able to make those determinations?
So when we looked at the documentation that they had for these savings, we asked them just to give us whatever they had. We often would get only one or two sentences that, again, just sort of described the initiative rather than explained how they came to that figure. So we would want to see something, for example, like what are some of the alternatives that were considered to implement this initiative? How did they actually get to this figure? And as I mentioned before, things like whether they took into account opportunity costs. So we really need more than just one or two sentences.
You get in this work to one of the debates that's probably happening as we speak on Capitol Hill regarding the National Defense Authorization Act discussions, and that is you write this: there's a risk that collaboration may not be sustained in light of any organizational changes that Congress or DOD may make. It sounds like what you're getting at there is the potential dissolution of the office of the Chief Management Officer. Am I reading too much between the lines, Elizabeth?
No, I think you're spot on, and that is something that we are watching very closely. So both the House and the Senate versions of the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act would eliminate the Chief Management Officer position. There has also been bipartisan support for the position in recent months that has said, this is not a good idea. At GAO, we have long advocated for the department to have a very senior official, could be a chief management officer, could be a second deputy secretary of defense, that would be another option, but someone who really has the authority, the resources, the clearly defined roles and responsibilities to be able to transform the department's business operations in a meaningful way. Again, coming back to that true definition of reform. So in this review, we found that current chief management officer has been working very well with the comptroller as well as the director of CAPE, cost assessment and program evaluation. And that's all really positive. But if the position goes away, there could be a lot of turmoil within the department. We know that leadership changes often set reform efforts back. So we are concerned about that.
We just have a moment left. The recommendations you make basically encompass addressing the things that we talked about here. What do you suggest the department do to preserve, if not the actual structure of the CMO, the collaboration that you think is important as you just outlined?
Yeah, that was one of our most important recommendations in this report. So right now, as I mentioned, they have good procedures in place to coordinate. They have ways of sharing information, ways of tracking progress. They know what their respective roles and responsibilities are, but none of that is written down. So formalizing that in written documents that can be sustained over years, regardless of what leadership changes might occur, is something that we really think the department needs to do. And I should note that the department and the chief management officer in particular concurred with all of our recommendations.
Elizabeth Field, thank you very much for joining me again. It's great to have you back.
Thanks so much.